the first session, as Colin said, is going to be it's going to be around the credit collections landscape. So there we just wanted to talk a bit about what are some of the wider challenges in credit collections that we're seeing, and what are some of the things that might be coming up on the horizon, particularly as we start to get back into going out and about and business starts to change again as well. So with that we've got, I don't know if the speakers want us to maybe just come up, we've got Anna Roughley, who's the head of Insight at Lending Standards Boards at the LSB. We've got Chris Leslie from the CSA. We've got Russell Hamblin-Boone from the Civil Enforcement Association, CIVEA, and Kevin Stone, who's the director of DEMSA. So thanks very much and welcome to join us. So I'm going to go stuff in the end. So we want this to be an informal session as we can. And I suppose, but for this session here, what we wanted to first do was start off with just maybe for these guys here, just give a bit of an overview really around who you are, and then what your organisation does, and then we've got a slide. We asked each of them to produce just one slide just to summarise, what do they see as being the key issues and some of the key issues in the future. So, Anna, do you want to go first? Maybe just quickly introduce yourself, and we'll introduce everyone, and then we'll go to the first slide. So maybe just go around and just quickly introduce yourself and what your organisation does.
Thank you very much. So I'm Anna Roughley, I'm the Head of Insight at the Lending Standards Board. We're the primary self-regulatory body for the banking and lending industry. Our registered firms comprise the major UK banks and lenders, debt collection, debt purchase firms, credit card providers, and fintechs. And our mission is to drive fair customer outcomes through independent oversight.
Chris?
Very good. I'm Chris Leslie. I'm the Chief Executive at the Credit Services Association. We're the trade body for the collections and debt purchase sector across the UK. And I've been in the role now for more than a year, so I haven't got any excuses any longer. But at some point on this, I've already made this joke once, but I'm going to make it again. When we modulate to the next verse, we'll all stand up and sing. Anyway, there you go. Dad jokes all over.
Yeah, they're singing about.
Good morning, I'm Russell Hamblin-Boone. I run the Civil Enforcement Association, which is a trade body representing firms that recover debt on behalf of local authorities. They employ enforcement agents who are colloquially known as bailiffs.
Hi, Kevin Still. I'm the Director of the Debt Management Standards Association. Been involved in the sector for quite some considerable time now, too long to remember now. Representing debt solution providers, debt advice providers, some insolvency practitioners, but increasingly now a number of the sort of fintech firms in the room who support our sector, particularly with what's described as disruptive technology, where we look at both enhancing customer journeys, but also trying to make some of them a little bit more efficient. So quite a lot of synergies with what these guys do as well.
So as we said, to kick off the day, we asked them just to pull together what are the 5 hot topics from your point of view that you're kind of seeing in the industry, and then what are the 3 developments that you think we've got to watch on, just to start with there, and I think you're going to go first and put the slide up. What do you think, what are the hot topics?
Thanks very much, Chris. So the first one we've got here is inclusive design, ensuring products and delivery are suitable for all. So this really is looking at those products and services and making sure that they are suitable for all. And what we mean by this is it's different to how you target your audience. It's making sure that that there are customers that are going to access those products or services that you haven't designed it for, but actually making sure that they're not disadvantaged by that. And there are ways that we can do this. So we've seen good examples where customer panels have been involved in the design and the product stages of this. And that really helps to make sure that the customer base is being considered and the different types of customers that might access these products. One of the other things that we have seen work really well is in the engagement of internal and external stakeholders. So what we mean by this is you might include a vulnerability specialist when designing that product journey. They're able to give a different view on what that might look like. As I mentioned, an external stakeholder could be a consumer group, but you can also look at external information that you have, such as complaints, customer feedback. And this data and MI is really valuable to use in the process, not only in the product design, but actually as you monitor that product working through. The second piece is around the new normal. And I think it's fair to say that the pandemic really created something that was unimaginable to us 2 years ago, that we'd all be working remotely. But we know now that there are many firms that are approaching a hybrid model or actually remote working permanently. So what do we need to focus on now? We know that we adapted really well as an industry to that change, and we put some sort of makeshift processes in place. We need to accept now that we're in that sort of BAU phase. So what we need to do is focus on how do we make improvements in that, basically. So in terms of approaching engagement, we're thinking about staff engagement. So there may be many beneficial things in remote working for existing members of staff, but actually we need to consider those new starters and also those that are early in their career. So do they need to understand who those key contacts are, how they're going to progress, have they got the right support in place for them? And then secondly, it's thinking about the operational environment. And there are some real key questions that firms need to ask themselves at the moment. And that is, are we delivering assurance in the right way, training, feedback? And why that's important is because we need to make sure that we're delivering the right outcomes and that our oversight and assurance is as effective in a remote environment as it is in the live environment. Because that's ultimately what's going to deliver those right outcomes. And if we're not, what are we going to do to raise those standards? And that leads me quite nicely on to the next piece, which is around culture. So we all know that culture, having a good culture, is really pivotal to making sure that we have those right outcomes in relation to conduct of a firm's business. And also we know that culture changes when we experience changes. So it's quite possible that through the pandemic we've seen our culture has changed. Or it's been destabilised, and that's because we've got this disjointed approach to work at the moment. So this is a really great opportunity for firms to consider what their culture looks like, how it has been impacted. And a way that firms can do this is by mapping their visions and their values to their customer outcomes and making sure that actually this is what we want to be achieving and we're achieving the right outcomes. In terms of flexibility, so adapting to change in underwriting and collections, one of the things we do know is that it's really unlikely that customer circumstances are not going to, are going to change through the life of that product they've taken out with you or through the service that you're providing to them. You know, we've just been through the biggest shock ever, but actually we know that there'll be circumstantial changes, financial changes. So how are we building these products and services? How are we considering that when we're putting these long-term agreements and plans in place? Because we know that there's going to be uncertainty, we know that there's going to be changes. So some of the things that we've seen at the LSB that firms are considering doing is putting a proactive contact strategy in place. So actually throughout the programme and the life of that agreement or product is, how's this working? Have there been any changes? And if that's not a suitable thing to do or not practical for you, it's actually, can we consider the MI that's available to us to see where these things might be breaking? So when we consider a forbearance plan, for example, can we look at that MI that you have available to you to say, when are these plans breaking and is there a particular point in the process that they're breaking? And if there is, what does that trend look like? Then let's do some customer root cause analysis. And then if we see that there's a fundamental problem in that outcome or that journey, putting those fixes in place. And then finally, of the current issues, I think we've got collaboration. And this is a real hot topic at the moment because everyone's talking about collaboration and cross-sector engagement. And a really great example we have of how this has worked well is in the vulnerability space. So if we think about signposting, it is now widely known and accepted that sometimes a customer is better supported by an organisation that's not yours. And that's how we brought signposting around, isn't it? You're working with external organisations, we know they come in and train you sometimes to help you and your teams understand how better to support their customers, and that you are referring them out to these different organisations. And that's a real strength actually, because we all want to do the right thing by customers, but actually recognising that you're not always the right organisation to do that. So that's a great example where that's worked. There's an opportunity here as well. and that is in the scam space. I don't think anybody here will have avoided seeing something in the media, or probably we've all received at least one text message to say, Royal Mail, click this link, pay X amount, or a parcel force message. We know that we're in the middle of a scam pandemic, if you like. But we also know that the scam doesn't just take place at the point you make that transaction. The LSB are the governors of the CRM code, so that's basically how signatory firms should behave in respect of authorised push payments. And as that scam does not take place at the instance where they first interact with the bank, there's a great opportunity here for cross-sector collaboration with, say, utilities, telecoms, social media platforms, so we can actually understand that entire customer journey, and we can then find those pinch points. Where are the opportunities earlier in that journey to prevent customers falling victim to these devastating scams? So in terms of future developments, as you know, from the Lending Standards Board, it probably be slightly remiss of me not to mention first of all about how self-regulation can mitigate risks in emerging areas. And the reason for this is that, you know, this change in credit and collections is happening. It's very fast-paced. We're seeing new entrants, digital-only providers, fintechs. We're seeing new products in high-risk areas, such as buy now, pay later products. And we're hearing that there are calls for regulation. And this is where there's a real good role for self-regulatory bodies here. The key is to be able to bring organisations together to get buy-in, to understand what the detriment is for customers and how we can close that gap. And the ability of the self-regulatory body to move agilely. Very often we can implement standards in place that takes much longer than it would do in a statutory regulatory environment, so that we can actually evidence as an industry that we want to protect our customers.
I'm conscious of time.
Sorry.
In terms of these things as well.
Yeah.
So you've got education, financial rehabilitation, practical identification in the digital space as well. Any other comments on that, or we'll move on to Chris? Or?
No, I would just say that actually I think it's really important that we're helping customers to improve their financial education so that we can get them out of those repeat instances where they are falling into financial difficulty, and also that in terms of digital identifying and helping customers to disclose in that digital space is a critical part of the
It does sound like we're a bit of, your view is kind of a bit of a crossroads in terms of like, there's something new is going to happen as a result of what's happened, and now we've got to think about flexibility, inclusion, we've got to think about how we work together, and then put those into samples going forward.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's just recognising that we're not in a position of, we're not reacting anymore.
Yeah.
We know what this landscape sort of looks like, and we need to review our processes and our procedures internally and as an industry to make sure that we are able to be responsive, flexible, adaptive. And I think that innovation essentially is one of the things that we've seen in bucket loads over the pandemic, and we need to be more like that.
Okay, fantastic. So next we're going to go to Chris, just about the CSA's view. So do you want to just go through, I suppose, so the hot topics you're seeing now, and then just some of the future developments you think we've got to have on our radar screen anyway.
Yeah, and thank you for putting it in the smallest font you could possibly find. It's really helpful. I'm not even going to try with those ones over there. Look, I'll be really brief and run through. It's funny when you ask what are the current issues. There's a bit of a snapshot.
Yeah.
But you know, constantly, we're still seeing signs of a sort of stigma around collections. I mean, you know, we had a consultation from the Treasury just the other day on buy now, pay later, where they talked about negative consequences, as though being contacted by a collections agency was in and of itself a negative consequence. And actually, we need those conversations to take place because they are the routes to resolving debt. And yes, of course, we want good signposting, debt advice agencies to track those work, but so too are those conversations with collections agencies. So anything that impedes that, particularly the stigmatisation, we've got to work on really hard. I wouldn't be doing my job as a trade association if, secondly, I didn't put up the issue of fees and levies and charges and compliance costs generally that are affecting not just the collections, debt purchase sector, but all financial services. It's very hard for individual firms to, make noise about that, but we put out a report a few months ago, just trying to get a grip on what exactly are the costs of compliance currently. And margins are very small, and the difficulty we find is that if compliance costs keep escalating, then these can't always be passed up the chain. What happens is that good activities that you would want to see developed, we've heard the Chancellor this week about green finance and all these other things, it's going to be very difficult to make progress on all of those, that sort of agenda, if compliance costs are particularly high. So we make representations to FCA, FOS and others about some of those things. And they're certainly not inflationary, the way these charges and levies come on. We're talking about many multiples. Professionalism, skills, this agenda is something actually the sector has been pretty good at in recent years. I mean, it's transformed particularly in the last 15 years. And yet there is, a lot of firms who are paying out their apprenticeship levy, for example, still find it complex to know, well, how am I going to use that? Or does it just go into the treasury pot and they don't do it? So can we find ways of making it easier for across the sector firms to invest in their own people? This last week, the reason I put the FCA commissions on in, that was a consultation that was perhaps the most recent. I thought it was quite interesting. The FCA, I felt, focusing very much on their own administrative concerns and questions. Yes, there were other reports that were sort of pushing it, but I don't know whether they quite realised that both the public sector and in the private sector as well, in panels and frameworks, often they have been using FCA authorisation as a proxy, as a sort of benchmark, and use it or lose it can really cut across the sort of competition issues in terms of an open market. So we've been keeping an eye on that one. And yeah, I mean, lots of things in the news. I mean, most recently we've seen all the, not all of them, but a lot of the energy utilities going into administration, and really big loopholes in the regulatory framework for utilities, for example, about, well, what happens if a firm is in administration, what happens to debts that are owed to it, and consumer concerns around that. So that's probably just a little run through of current issues. In terms of future issues, well, BNPL, deferred payment credit, it's a big talking point right now. Again, consultation about closing that, and I think most people are obviously accepting, yes, of course, needs to have sort of regulatory arrangements around that. So watching those sorts of developments, but there are other things going on as well, salary finance and other questions. There's a lot of innovation out there, and the regulatory framework doesn't always capture some of those things. To be honest, I'm still slightly sceptical about this proposal for the new consumer duty. The government naturally wanting, particularly as cost of living pressures are on the political agenda, wanting to show that they're on the side of consumers, absolutely. But the framework of regulation that we have, treating customers fairly, and all these, that have accrued in recent years, are pretty strong. And I'm not quite sure I see where the gap is in that consumer duty is necessarily going to fill. And the worry that I do have is, will this be potentially another opportunity for claims management companies and others to start chasing, if there are other legal obligations that come along in 10 years' time. So we're watching that. There's another consultation due in December on the enforcement of this consumer duty. So that will probably be even more critical than the principles one that we've had. SDRP and others we're going to talk about are issues. Finally, the bee in my bonnet currently is the identity verification practices, IDV issues. Exactly as Anna, you were saying, because there's a lot of concern about scams. When people, I know when I get a phone call, hello, are you Chris Leslie? Yes. Can you give me your postcode and first line of your address and all the rest of it? Date of birth? What? You must be joking. And of course, we want engagement, as I was saying at the beginning. We need conversations to happen. And if we don't get right what the best practice is on that first bit of the conversation for outbound calls, we're going to be losing and impeding conversations that are really helpful to people to solve their problem of debt, because of what may be slight over-emphasis on some of the data issues at the beginning of the call. Of course, you've got to be careful with, are you speaking to the right person? Nobody would doubt that. but there's also risk to the consumer if you don't conclude the conversation. So I think there are solutions in that, there's even technological solutions in that. So that's one of the things I would keep in mind. Sorry if that's too long.
I'm interested. But bubbling development, I suppose, that's sort of going on. So, okay. And Russell, what about from your point of view? Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, so I was going to talk about public debt collection because one of I think now the biggest cause of problem debt is debt that's owed to local and central government. There's a number of reasons that sort of occurred pre-COVID, changes to the benefit system, more people having to pay council tax than have been before, councils having to chase debt more rigorously as a result of austerity. And then we kind of got to the point of sort of COVID hitting and the whole landscape changing and that requiring public debt collection to look very different as well. And it's sort of, there's an assumption, and probably quite rightly actually, that DCAs are held up as the exemplar of how to do debt collection and the technology that they use and the sympathetic response they have to debtors. But there's an assumption that isn't happening in local authorities. And although there's a sort of a mix within local authorities, there are a lot of progressive thinking councils, and the sort of advent of COVID has enhanced that sort of smart thinking differently about how they can go about collecting what is an excessive amount of debt. So some of the things around affordability assessments, communications with customers, working with enterprise sectors, all of those things go on in the public sector, just as they do as parts of just regular good practice within the private sector. I'm glad that I brought those because then I don't have to read trying to read the things there. So, for example, when it comes to collections, although enforcement firm bailiffs have the authority to visit people and they have the powers to officially take control of goods, well, that rarely tend to have their goods taken away. Most of their collections are actually done in the same way as DCAs do their collections, which is engagement with people through the various communication channels, trying to set up repayment plans on behalf of councils and find other ways for people to restructure their debts in order for councils to be able to recover the debt to meet the shortfalls that they have. But recent sort of changes in attitudes to debt, as Chris was saying, sort of stigmatisation, and also the advent of COVID has meant that it's not appropriate anymore for councils to sort of be processing people, which pushes them down a route where you end up having someone knocking on the door. And so the enforcement industry, along with councils, is having to think differently about this whole process. At the moment, around half of public debt is collected before you need to have, before there's an enforcement visit to someone's property. But that's half, and we need that figure to be much higher, which means that we need to start to take advantage of some of the technology that we're, as a judge on the awards panel that I've seen coming through in the private sector. And the public sector is starting to take an interest in that, some councils more progressive than others. So there's quite a lot of change going on within the sector as it is. And it's important to do that because by the time we get to April 2022 and the councils are sending out their next set of council bills, people who were in debt pre-COVID could end up with 3 years worth of arrears. So the idea of in-year collections, for example, where councils require enforcement firms to collect someone's arrears before the end of the next financial year, is not feasible anymore. So we're getting to this point where there's a very difficult balance between making sure that councils are recovering money to fill the shortfall, the costs of COVID. It's estimated there's about £847 million outstanding of council tax last year alone that was not paid. On an average basis, enforcement agents collect around £500 million of unpaid council tax. So there's a lot of money that's needed to meet the shortfalls that councils have got from the cost of COVID, at the same time as recognising that they have to be very careful and cautious about the way they're collecting that, because there's a lot of more people who've gone into vulnerable situations. And not only that, but those people in vulnerable situations may not know the benefit system. People who've been in work all their lives suddenly finding themselves redundant or facing ill health as a result of the implications and some of the consequences of COVID. So we have to be responsive to those people's needs as well, which means that councils have to start thinking differently, thinking more long term, thinking about segmenting. You know, are there people who perhaps can pay some of their debts, even if they can't pay all of their debts? Can we start to identify those people who need the real support? And of course, the paradox is that the people who need help from the council aren't able to get it because the council is being sensitive about collecting its debt. Only about 60% of council, or about 60% of council tax collection has been resumed since we've come out of COVID. Sorry, I'll move on to the challenges, the future developments. So one of the consequences of all of these things is that we need some thought leadership and we need better oversight for the industry. And I'm pleased to say that over the last few months, actually COVID has been a great help in harnessing resources and focusing minds in developing the Enforcement Conduct Authority, which is a new oversight body for the industry, offering self-regulation, which will help to drive up standards as well as driving out any bad practice. And then with councils are looking at things like a single customer view. They're recognising that actually there are lots of different streams within the council. People might have different debts, whether it's a parking fine or whether it's to do with housing benefits overpayments or council tax debt. And recognising they've got lots of data, often duplicated on the same people, but if they bring that together, take it out of those silos and amalgamate it, actually they get quite a good customer view, and they can start to profile people better. Some councils are starting to progress that. Some of you are they're using some of the technology that you're developing. And the final point I've already made is just thinking differently, breaking the mindset, which is really hard for public servants sometimes who have processes that are embedded. And that's where, as an industry, from the sort of private sector, we're able to do what I call the tail wagging the dog. We're able to start to develop some good things, some good practice, and by association, the councils are following suit and taking the lead from that. So public debt collection is going to be one of the challenges of the future. But thankfully, with the sort of developments that we're seeing in technology, we're starting to see some solutions to that.
Fantastic, thank you. Kevin, what's your
My eyesight's probably the worst of everybody's, so I'm probably going to ad-lib at the moment. So, from what I recall, I'm putting up first up, I think one of the key messages that I was looking at, in particular here, a term that's used a lot at HMRC, which is debt prevention, but particularly the point that Chris has made more recently now on the energy firms. We've got 2 million people who are, through no choice of their own, being switched provider. And at the same time, those people onboarding those clients need to understand who they're onboarding. And indeed, I think Chris has reflected something that he get left behind with the receiver, which is potentially more worrying. But making sure that you've got a data-led strategy, not just your own data, but making that wider position. And in HMRC, it's things like fine avoidance. In energy, it's making, and water, it's making sure somebody's on the right tariff, social tariff, whatever that may be. And those are things that you're beginning to see now, where you see what's called upstream compliance beginning to come into play, so that people are more comfortable that they are on the right tariff. You know, they're not in credit, which is a major problem for the energy at the moment, is you've got somebody taking on somebody who's in credit and who's actually going to pay for that. So data sharing, and in the 2 years I've just done at HMRC, has been a revelation to me. You know, when we went from the UK's largest tax collector to paying out 12 million people, and we had to do that in 4 weeks, showed some of the thought leadership that's now going on, and we're beginning to see it now around things like the vulnerability toolkit. And what I'm hoping to see is, many years ago, and you know, there are a number in the audience that will remember the days when we set up the credit industry fraud avoidance scheme, and it wasn't competitive unless you weren't involved. And the key to me now on vulnerability and some of the data sharing is critical. And it doesn't matter which sector you looked at, so some of the things that we probably haven't mentioned today, Gambling Commission have just come out with some of their information on what their merchants need to do. And when you look at it, 20 million plus gamblers, 250,000 odd problem gamblers, and then the problem is being pushed to the credit industry as well. Not just the creditor, grantors, but the debt advice sector. How would you build proportionality in to determine who's a problem gambler and who's somebody doing something that's a social activity that they can afford? But tools like open banking, all of the toolkits that we're now looking at become more and more critical to where data is available, you know, for vulnerability. I'm working in the fintech space with a firm that's set up a vetted carer database that's had to go through all sorts of hoops with the FCA, but with a view that the carer may potentially be the one who's defrauding their parents. But there's 5.8 million carers. You know, how would you change your process where you're dealing with somebody that has got full authority? And that goes back to some of these customer journeys. It's identifying how that data is going to be utilised. HMRC, DWP under the Digital Economy Act are two of the biggest data sharers, but is that data used? I mean, I was shocked when a very good presentation last week from Southwark, who warned the audience that the councils may vary in their behaviour significantly, to the extent that some councils may just resume where they were 18 months ago, and a client out of the blue is going to just get enforcement activity because nobody's actually filled the gap in between. And another observation that was very key was, and I think supported by many in the audience, that because of the lack of nudges and shoves in that interim period, there's no engagement with the debt advice sector. So all of this pre-engagement, this drive, you know, it's just not happening. We've got to put our money where our mouth is, and that is in relation to this, close the 9-month gap it takes before somebody actually genuinely engages, shorten that, and then also recognise, which is probably my main bugbear at the moment, which is I see all the technology, and a lot of it's fantastic, but all I hear is, this is what it'll do to your bottom line, Mr. Collector, Mr. Bank. How are you bringing the customer along with it? So there's some really good bits of tech out there. You've got to bring the consumer along with you. So in particular, what I'm beginning to see where there's a lot more convergence between our markets, but what you may find there's a step in between. And some of the guys that are focusing on vulnerability are doing this very well. But often the collector recognises they don't have the type of relationship to get full-blooded engagement with data. They need it to push it to somebody where their consumer data is held in an environment that's trustworthy until they recognise they're comfortable with open banking. And then they're comfortable to share some of the data with their creditors and then actually full engagement. And that's what I'm seeing now a little bit more of, is that are those trusted consumer environments where they can share but learn to trust. Because the scam part of this is key. On IDMV, totally agree. We need to be able to embrace all the technologies that people use on their iPhone. Yeah, and there's nothing more bizarre we used to find at HMRC than somebody's coming in through my voice is my password or a voice biometric. The journey breaks down in the IVR system, and then you've got to find out what the name of their favourite dog is. But you don't know which of the 18 systems you come into because the IDMV is different on every single one. So that omni-channel approach has got to be joined up. And there's a lot of people in this room who are capable of doing it rather than having these bolt-ons. But I come at it from the consumer's view. I see it through their lens. But at the moment, there's a long way to go to get that trust so that they will do open banking, they will do these digital journeys. We've got to find a way collectively. You know, this audience is a pretty good starting point to get that consumer trust in play.
So some of that was quite a good segue to some of the questions. And I was going to say to the audience here, so there's a Slido, we've got Slido. So if you want to ask questions, please do use that button. It's just at the bottom of the screen there. So CC Tech Think Tank. I've got the Slido questions here, but we've got a series of questions. Some of that's quite a good segue in terms of like you've heard, I suppose, from here around what the industry bodies kind of think around what's happened, what some of the key hot topics are, what some of the future is. I mean, for me, the last sort of like 12, 18 months felt like it was a bit of a blip to a certain extent, like everything sort of stopped, and now things are starting again. And I was quite interested in exploring how much do we have to think about, you know, cleaning up what happened over the last 18 months versus some of the new tech that's been talked about around going forward as well. And is there a balance there between, because it's not all about changing things going forward, but also essentially got situations we need to clean up as well. And so it's just what's the balance between that and how do we need to think about it differently? And then Chris, I don't know if you've got a kind of view on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I personally have been pleasantly surprised with how well the collections and purchase sector have endured during this particular period. I mean, none of us really could have predicted where we would be now. I know certainly my general assumption right at the beginning was that we were going to see, you know, higher employment, widespread indebtedness, a great increase in distressed indebtedness and so on and so forth. And actually the missing ingredient was, of course, this massive dollop of government welfare intervention, furlough, payment deferrals, bounce back loans. I mean, it's been phenomenal. And so actually we've seen a situation where not everybody, you know, because there's always a minority of people who are in really difficult and vulnerable circumstances. But actually, in aggregate, people have been able to pay down perhaps more than we all expected. And you know, the whole world, not just in the UK, has one eye to, well, what is going to be the stock and flow of non-performing loans in the future as things normalise, as the level of state intervention recedes, and will that be some sort of normalisation? I think a lot of the sector have certainly been, you know, improving and investing in their own systems, while perhaps there have been big payment deferrals and pauses on certain things. So actually, it hasn't been a standstill. There has been investment sort of going on.
And how much do you think is what we have today? Is this going to be what we're talking about being the new normal? Is this or is something I think we're talking about even more change down the road? So you think it's unwinding that's going to happen, as well as potentially more changes coming down the road as well. I mean, what's kind of the panel's view on that? I mean, is it?
Well, all I was going to say is I think regulators are under a lot of political pressure, particularly because we're going to see interest rates ticking up, we're going to see inflation higher. What are the government going to do about it is the usual cry, which then turns into, well, what are the regulators going to do about it? And you can expect that eventually to filter down in terms of, you know, this is why I think the consumer duty is an interesting one to watch, because that's quite a moment where they can turn the volume up to show that they're doing something about it to protect the consumer. So I think we could see regulatory responses as a sort of proxy for political action to help the public with some of the cost of living pressures.
Yeah, so the regulatory angle is quite interesting. We're chatting some of the pre-conversation we had around. I mean, it almost feels like with the lockdown happening, the regulator was, you know, I think we used the word, was quite understanding, I suppose, in terms of like, you know, the systems we put in place, how we sort of dealt with it, particularly remote work and those kind of things. I mean, there's been some discussion around, you know, if we do return back to normal, this is the new normal, does the view of the regulator come back and put more controls on us, and how should we start thinking about that as an industry? I mean, do you know
Yeah, absolutely. I think the regulators had to recognise that they needed to allow firms the time to react and put processes in place to ensure that they're sort of, you know, that consumer protection was there firstly. But I think moving forward, and I think it all links back to that balance piece as well that you mentioned earlier, it's there's a number of things to do, and from a regulatory perspective and what we need to be preparing for, is that we do need to do a look back. And we know that all of our assurance activity and oversight really should be risk focused, shouldn't it? So we know that there's pockets of risk, so we do need to do a look back on what's happened, what's coming out of that, are there customer group cohorts of customers that need some protection. But actually we also need to get used to looking to the forward piece as well, to try and protect ourselves. We've seen some really great innovation, but we need to be able to maintain that. And I think the regulators are going to be looking at what are we looking to in the future, how are we safeguarding customers moving forward. And we've heard the FCA talking, I've heard Charles Randall at the FCA talking about things such as how they're going to be proactive and looking at how firms are safeguarding customers in that future piece. But naturally there will be a look back, because of course we have learnings, don't we, and that's where we really get that valuable information, so I think we can't take our eye off
And
that.
how much do you think the regulatory focus is going to affect the way we work today, particularly things like remote working and those kind of things? Because we've sort of got into this mode of sort of doing remote working, sort of like, we've got, a lot of us have got agents, advisors at home, potentially as well. Is that, do you think that's going to change, or is there some new controls that are going to be put in place?
The regulator is going to be looking to firms to understand that they have the right controls in place, and so what we do know is that many firms are moving to a permanent home working, remote working base, or they're doing that hybrid model. So actually, like, the regulation isn't going to change. If you're working at home in your home office or in your living room, how are those protections in place for customers? And we know that the FCA wrote out to firms quite recently saying that it's within their power to go and visit that to make sure that those protections are in place. So firms absolutely need to be revisiting those assurance and oversight arrangements, as I mentioned earlier, to make sure that they are as robust in the remote working environment as they are in the live environment. And if they're not, what are we doing? What are we going to do to raise those standards? So I think that's definitely going to be a focus for the regulator.
I'm going to go to Karen on this one. So we had a conversation around, what's the state of play between different industries? And I know you mentioned HMRC earlier, and how have you sort of seen that in terms of advancements in terms of remote working, blended working versus home working? And are there things we can learn across different industries?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, critically, there's a very strong union base within the civil service, and the pay and contract reform that came in earlier this year meant a 13.5% pay increase for 30-odd thousand agents working for 2 to 3 days a week from home. We did dress rehearsal last year when sort of the 30,000 moved out of the call centres to work from home, and 20,000 became web chat agents. So not only did their role change, their modus operandi changed, and all of that will inevitably change, brought about by that contract reform. But it's about embracing it. Or what I think I've heard recently from Mark Gill, the CSA event, Nick Jones more recently in the insolvency event, and Christian last week at MAL, they are genuinely, for the first time, engaging the debt advice sector, which I think is fact, doing more data sharing, and as a result of that, they're now looking at the tools that you need, and having deployed a number of these as part of it, how do you build more QA into some of these omni-channel journeys? How do you do the equivalent of floor walking for these people? But the flip side of this, which we asked Sheldon last week, is, and which he replied, he's got a brother who's based in Bristol, now earning a London salary, working totally remote, is the law of unintended consequences that this diverse talent pool, and last week was about diversity, you can now fish for people that have got the language skills and other capabilities. But we have an example just before, which is why I asked the question, a debt advisor increased their salary by £8,000 overnight, still stuck at home. Imagine that in HMRC where most of the collections are stuck up in East Kilbride, and you can now go off, and we've already heard from Chris, margins are very thin in contingency collections, they're very thin in debt advice. And at the moment, many of my members are focused around the supply chains of the Money and Pension Service, and that you've got to critically look at every activity, more quality, more innovation, continuous improvement. So for those that are supporting the sector, collaborating, investment and periods to invest is just as important. So to me, things like MAPS investing for 3 to 5 years in my sector is really important, because it allows you to build those foundations, which includes remote and hybrid working, and to look at some of the tools for the providers outside that said, how do you use speech analytics, sentiment analytics, other tools to replicate quality assurance? What does quality assurance look like in a digital journey? And we're at a very embryonic stage of what that looks like. So I think we're going to do things in bite-sized chunks, but as we said earlier, it's going to be quite agile, quite dynamic, and we've got to keep taking this on.
It does sound like we're almost like at another inflection point, which is, okay, what's happened's happened, but now you still need to invest now, because if it's going to be like this going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the FCA's paper recently is another one of their, what they do very regularly with DSEO, very effectively. A bit like we saw with vulnerability. There's 2 consultation papers, and woe betide you if you don't know what the final one in February is, because there's going to be no event time, you need to be ready. And what they've said is transition is over, transformation is now. So come and tell us what your business model's like, but show me the board minutes from when you went into lockdown to where you are now, to show that the people at the top have thought about that culturally and where this is going to take them.
So, Ross, I don't know if you
Well,
noticed those.
I was going to say that's all very well, but actually it's a little bit unfair, I think, to put that pressure on firms to have had sorted out all the governance, all of the risk factors and everything else in such a short period of time without an opportunity to do any testing, just to leap into something, get their IT departments to do things that for years they said it was impossible to do, to get people working at home or whatever. There are going to be things that go wrong, whether it's in the private sector, in the public sector. Lots of revenue collection teams have just closed down their offices now, and they're just all home-based. So there's a lot of data sitting in people's homes at the moment. We don't really have the protections that we should have around it. But I think it's a little unfair for the regulators to say you need to have those protections or we're going to come down on you hard. I think we have to sort of be a little bit flexible and recognise that we're going to be learning from some mistakes here. We can't assume that the first thing that goes wrong means, right, well, that's the end of the home working regime then. And for a risk-averse regulator, that's quite a hard thing to get their head around. And maybe we need to push a little bit harder and say, we can do this if this is what you want us to do. But give us the opportunity to fall over a little bit and to stumble, because that's what's going to happen. Otherwise, let's not do it.
The one thing actually wasn't mentioned was, I suppose, vulnerability, vulnerable customers, and sort of treating vulnerability. I mean, what's kind of the view on that? I mean, does that go in terms of some of the same tools that need to be thought about? And how should we start thinking about that, and thinking back, I suppose, to the customer duty piece as well? And what should we be thinking, putting in today, trying to get ready for that? And Chris, you give me your view, but maybe Anne, do you want to maybe just give a little bit of a view around what do you think about customer duty? I mean, do we have to put some changes in places now? How do you think about that with vulnerabilities?
I think that the consumer duty piece is, very outcomes focused, and we are an industry that are quite used to talking about outcomes focused our approach to our work. So I think one of the things from the Learning Standards Board perspective is our standards are outcomes focused. So I think we'll set firms in good stead that are signed up to those to help them to be ready for when the consumer duty piece comes into play. I think that, to your point, Russell, we know things do fall over. As a regulator, we know that things go wrong sometimes, but what we're looking for is the infrastructure around that, around how is that identified, how do we act upon it when that happens, what are we doing to rectify that behaviour, to make sure customers are okay in that space. So this is around all customers, Chris, vulnerable customers included in that. So I think it's just recognising, I understand what you're saying, absolutely, but making sure that we've got that infrastructure in place to be able to be looking for, if we make changes, that post-implementation phase, and looking, how is this working, is it working as intended, and building that infrastructure to enable you to identify that afterwards.
So questions that actually just come in around financial education. Do we need to do more on that with the customer base as part of this as well, as much as sort of like handling the current situation? What about the financial education piece of it?
I'm happy to pick up
Yeah,
that, if that's okay. This is one of the things on one of the bullet points somewhere on my slide, sorry. I'm a real advocate for customer education. And a good example of this actually is in the scams space. So one of the provisions of the CRM code is around aftercare. And the reason that that's important is that when a customer is falling victim to a scam, the signatories to that code are required to provide aftercare, and the purpose of that is to prevent that customer from falling victim to a scam again and just help them to give some tailored information. And I definitely think there's a space for customer education and rehabilitation moving forwards. And this isn't just the job of one organisation, I think it's the job of the industry. And I think it's about helping customers to, not just in this particular instance, so if they're in their collections environment, not just helping them to get out of that particular situation, but helping them to become more assured moving forwards in the way that they handle their finances, that hopefully they might be able to either withstand the economic shock a little bit better in the future, or actually be aware and confident enough to say actually there's a problem and to engage earlier with their creditor, because actually that education is all of our role, and that will help rehabilitate and build that strength and financial well-being.
This is a point I touched on in my slide about a new cohort of people who are vulnerable, who were managing quite well until COVID came along and they faced redundancy at very short notice, or they faced ill health which led to them not being able to work. And it wasn't so long ago I was in a similar situation, and if you don't know the system because you haven't don't know the benefit system, perhaps you've been fortunate like me and always been in work, to suddenly get thrown into that system, whether it's with creditors or with the government and the job centre and whatever, it's not really designed for us types of people, kind of people who might question why you get pushed from here to here and here. It's not designed to recognise for people who are not vulnerable, really. They're quite capable of managing, but they don't have the education to know that they can negotiate with creditors, for example. And so we need to start perhaps thinking about this new cohort of people. What is it they need? They're probably going to get themselves on their feet quite quickly, but they don't know where to go for help. They don't know that creditors are even going to be able to help them. They just assume that that's it, they're going to be chasing you for debt, and you get into a spiral.
Christian?
Only just to say, yes, I think that's completely right. And different sectors will have different approaches to vulnerability issues, and certainly in the collections sector, there are pretty good systems already. And I've been at the CSA for just over a year. I've been really quite bowled over by there is a massive amount of forbearance that often goes unnoticed, unspoken upon, but it is actually very, very generous. When breathing space came along, it wasn't actually a particularly difficult thing for the collection sector to cope with, because they were already offering often many more, a lot longer periods of deferral. So vulnerability systems have been quite well embedded in the collection sector. What I am interested in, though, is where the FCA are going with vulnerability, because there are different types of vulnerability. And I thought it was quite notable in their survey that they did. They came out with a figure that 54% of the population were vulnerable. Now, that may well be true, but actually, you just got to be a little bit. What are the component parts of it? I mean, there were certain elements. So if an individual was going through a relationship breakdown, that was counted as vulnerability. Well, does it? I suppose it does in some respects, but not all vulnerability is the same. And my worry was that if we end up throwing this blanket of vulnerability too widely, you almost devalue real, genuine, multiple and counterfeit levels of vulnerability that some of the really most impoverished people can suffer. And so I would just sound a note of caution to the FCA that don't throw the blanket so wide that you lose those that really need extra support, because that's embedded in some very significant vulnerability.
So we're almost at time, and there have been a few questions coming in. I'll say that if we haven't answered questions this session, try and answer them in the next session, and then if we don't answer them, we'll get back and we'll come back to some of the questions from the panelists as well. So we will do that just like we've done the online versions. So the last question I had, I suppose, just in one statement, just to finish off, is if we take ourselves back 18 months, and if we knew what we know now 18 months ago, what would we have done differently? And it's not so much to go back and say, well, look, we should have done this differently, we should have these systems in place now, but more around reflection, like what should we have in place today to make sure that we're ready should something like this happen in the future, we're going to be insulated for the future. So just a bit of reflection, just not to the looking forward, I suppose. Ken, do you want to go first? Or?
Yeah, again, I go back to some of the earlier discussion. I think where we had something as significant as all your staff having to switch to moving home, I think it's brought into focus, things like the business continuity plans to look at some of these what-if scenarios to say what are the major blockers. In our sector beforehand, you'd have catastrophic events like somebody freezes your client account and you can't distribute money. That might be right very high at the top of the risk scenario, but I think this whole challenge has highlighted how do I keep the business going, how do I look at the different channels, am I tied to one particular medium of communication and one method? So you saw face-to-face debt advice virtually shut down. And for those that was the only tool in their box, it was pretty catastrophic when everybody expected a lot of demand. And if forbearance hadn't come in through the FCA regulated firms and the government schemes, it would have been catastrophic. So I think every business needs to look at that business continuity factor.
Awesome. Any thoughts or?
Yeah, well, I think probably the thing you take away is that when there is a need to take risks, actually that's where the innovation is coming from, and it goes back to my point about being too risk averse. When there's a need and there's not enough time to go through it with a fine-tooth comb to explain why you can't do that, and you actually do it, then you can look at it, then you can look at the outcomes, and then you can make the tweaks, as opposed to your starting position is, right, you can't do it, so prove to me why you can.
Yeah, I mean, I think the lesson of this most recent business interruption period has been good record keeping, strong data, standards, all of those things, that if you are disrupted, the operational resilience is there and is constantly attended to. And it's very difficult to scenario plan. I mean, people would never have predicted that a pandemic would have hit in this particular way. All I would say is, don't expect government to bail out the next time a big one of these things comes along, because it just won't have the resources to do it. I mean, this has been more than once in a lifetime. And similarly, don't expect regulators to come up with a solution. I completely agree with Russell. If you're too risk averse and you end up with a sector that sort of waits to be told what to do from on high, it will be crippled. So you do have to actually foster and encourage and reward that risk-taking sometimes.
I want to reinforce that innovation piece, and that I think comes through everything here, is that actually creating, and it's linked to culture, creating that culture of challenge, openness and transparency, being open to say, actually, is this right, is this working, or is there a better way, and given the opportunity to foster that innovation and that growth, to try something different. I think that's something that we should really take forward.
So that's why I hope you said that earlier on, so it's the flexibility, keeping the innovation, making sure you're ready, don't have all your eggs in one basket, right? It's kind of like this. And it's important to have that today, because I think that how that goes going forward as well. So it's that way. Well, I'm going to thank the panelists very much for their input and their insight. So thank you very much, and we're going to move on to the next session, but I really appreciate it. So, and any questions we didn't answer, we'll definitely get back to them. So thank you.